All right, in this video, we're going to talk about a couple questions we should ask about any study in psychology that claims causation, that claims one variable causes another. We're going to want to think about the external validity of the study and also about the internal validity of the study. So let's dive into each of those in turn. First off, external validity asks, does your study generalize to people or situations beyond this specific setup? Like, yeah, your study is cool and all, but does it apply to the real world? Does it apply in general, even in a context different than the laboratory you did your test in, different than the city you did your test in? So one strategy to get good external validity would be to take a random sample of the entire population. And what I mean by that is the entire population that you're going to generalize to, and you test them in a real life sort of setting or situation. By using random sampling and a big enough sample size, you ensure a representative sample that matches the whole population pretty well. Compare that to a strategy that might have poor external validity. Imagine a researcher brings only college students into a really artificial lab setting to do a task that's a simplified version of the task in the real world that they're actually interested in. In that case, even if we consistently find some cool result in our experiment, we can't be very sure that the result has implications outside of the lab, or outside of young people, or outside of those who are educated and thus have a higher than average socioeconomic status and all sorts of other differences. We can't be confident that our results generalize, which is what we usually mean when we say a study has poor external validity. To take an example, say we're studying the effects of cardio exercise on depression. That's an important topic with real-world implications, right? So, to avoid testing only college students, maybe we're smart, we put up some flyers all around town in both the rich and the poor neighborhoods. So we're looking for volunteers for our study. Maybe it's a 3-month study. The flyers mention participants have to have been diagnosed with depression, not currently have an exercise routine. And our plan is once we get all these volunteers, we randomly split them up into 2 groups and have group 1 jog daily on an indoor treadmill, and maybe group 2 just walks daily on an indoor treadmill. So one group gets their heart rate up and, gets proper cardio, while the other does a similar control task. Seems like a good setup, right? Then we'll see if depression improves more for the cardio group. So that's our plan. Maybe we wait for 30 volunteers who meet our qualifications, or more, whatever the amount is. Then we run the experiment. At the end of the study period, we're going to compare the depression scores of those 2 groups using a t-test. And let's say we find that the cardio group improved more and it was statistically significant. Sweet! So cardio helps people with depression, right? We can write up our results. We can share it with the press. We can make news that our study showed cardio improves depression. Except that someone might point out a problem, which is that we didn't test a representative sample of depressed people. What do I mean? Well, we only test depressed people, like a subset of depressed people. Those who have a certain personality profile. Like, those who completed our study are the type of depressed people who still had the energy to participate in the first place, who were actively seeking ways to improve their situation, who could overcome lethargy or hopelessness enough to call the number on the flyer, or for that matter, who had depression mild enough to actually get out of bed and thus be able to see the flyer in the first place. So our study doesn't technically generalize to all depressed people, only to the type of depressed person who would volunteer for a study like this. Now, does that mean we should throw out our study or say that our results are useless and can't help those with depression? No, not necessarily. But it means we need to be careful about the limitations of how widely our results generalize. We need to acknowledge the limitations to external validity of our study. No study is going to have perfect external validity, but realizing and acknowledging the ways in which a study does or doesn't generalize is helpful for putting results in context and also for discovering some of the heterogeneity of effects, meaning circumstances or people where an effect works more in some cases or others, for some people or for other people. We can discover that better when we take external validity seriously. But for now, let's move on from external validity to something that can be a little more complicated, which is internal validity. So this is a question of whether your study really provides evidence of causation. The more internal validity, the better the evidence for causation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And likewise, if there's weak internal validity, we shouldn't really be so confident that the IV causes the DV. So let's briefly discuss the logic of a true experimental design. This is our best tool for finding evidence of causation when we want to go beyond just finding a correlation between things. We want to do an experiment. And the idea is, if we can create a situation where groups or conditions differ in just one way, just on the independent variable, and no other difference between the groups, and then later any dependent variable difference that we find in the groups, well, it must have come from the IV, since the IV was the only thing different between the groups. So our big goal is to compare groups or conditions in such a way that the only explanation for any difference we find has to come from the independent variable manipulation. If the only thing different between the groups is the IV, then that's the only possible explanation for the results. Like, the basic logic of an experiment makes good sense, as you can see there. So let's take an example scenario then. Imagine an educational psychologist wants to test a 3-month program aimed at helping first graders who are falling behind in math. So they measure math skill before the training period, then they give this amazing training program, then they measure math skill at the end. Let's say they statistically test the average math skill after training and find that it's higher than the average math skill before training. The symbol here, by the way, is a Greek letter mu. It's used to represent an average or a mean score of a group. Now, in this scenario, we instituted a training program, and the kids got better afterward. So it sure seems like the program works, right? And maybe the government should start funding us at scale up this training in schools across the country, right? Or is there some other alternative explanation for the kids scoring better later on? We'll take a moment and see if you can think of some alternative explanations for why our students were better at math after the program, even if the program doesn't work. So pause the video and jot down a couple ideas before unpausing. Okay, so there are a lot of potential answers here that provide an alternative explanation. We might call these things, we might call them threats to internal validity, meaning things that undermine internal validity because of how we did our study. So alternative explanations that show up. So for one thing, other events might happen between time 1 and time 2. For example, maybe a new season of Sesame Street started after time 1, and the improvement comes from kids watching Sesame Street. We call this threat history. Like, I don't know, if you institute a law in 1980 and then measure how it affected some variable 30 years later in 2010, you're trying to study the effect of the law. There might have been other events, other kind of historical events during that time, other than the law, that affected the variable you're measuring. So it's just other stuff kind of going on outside of the study that in this case might cause improvement in the child's math scores. Also, people just change and mature as time passes. Like, kids grow, their brains develop, and they naturally mature over time. So we call this threat to internal validity, we call it maturation. And that would explain why our kids were better at math after the program. Maybe they were just older and their brains had had a little more time to develop. Maybe it's not our training program, maybe this is the explanation. Also, just being tested that first time when they got the pretest at the start, that gave the kids some math practice. And specifically, it might even be it might have been the same kind of questions or similar question types to the test that's given afterward. So that practice, that testing, might change results of the later measurement. Like, think about it. Taking the pretest could make the kids more aware of that type of math problem, maybe that type of story problem, or whatever it is that's used there. So we call this testing effects. And it is another threat to internal validity. That might explain why they did better at the end. There's also instrument change. Like the measurement instrument might change between time 1 and time 2. So maybe the post-test at the end is actually a bit easier of a math test, even just by accident. Like maybe the word problems on the after test, the later test, just happen to be worded a little more clearly or easier to understand. So maybe that is why students did better on the after test. Or perhaps a different experimenter graded the tests at time 2. Now, for math tests, this might not be such a big deal, but imagine a writing test where someone is grading your writing, like on the SAT writing sample or something. If you have a different experimenter at the second time, you can see how that might just, maybe there's an easy scorer, right? So that might bias the results and give higher scores later, even if no one genuinely improved from the training program. There's also a threat called mortality, which sounds pretty dark, but it doesn't have to refer to death or anything, although originally it refers to people dropping out of studies like, a clinical trial or something because they literally died. But what it really means here is just that people might drop out of the study, so it's about attrition, like leaving a study for whatever reason, but the people might drop out of a study partway through, especially in a way that biases the results. Like, in our example, what if the poor performing children, the ones who scored The worst, during our pre-test at the start, maybe those same children are just more likely to drop out of the study or more likely to drop out of school altogether. Maybe they're just, lower socioeconomic status, they don't have as much support, their parents can't, help as much, so they have to go get a job. They're more likely to drop out of school. So the ones who had not done well on our initial test, they're just ones who are more likely to not be there when we give the later test. So that would, if it happened, make the group average go up. So the only people that are left, right, the low scorers are gone, so the only people that are left are the higher scorers, so our average score would have gone up even if no one improved at all. So in that case, the higher scores at the end wouldn't be due to our training program, but because we're no longer including some people who were bringing the average down. So these problems I've named here, they're called threats to internal validity because they are all alternative explanations where the independent variable may not actually be what caused any improvement or change in the dependent variable. Let's consider another kind of common threat to internal validity by looking at a different scenario. Imagine a basketball coach wants to improve the team's free throws. So after game 1, she picks out the worst free throwers and says, I'm going to give you this some personal training. I'm going to give you this patented training program I've come up with. And sure enough, in later games, those team members do better than in game 1. So their free throws are just like all landing or more landing, right? So the training program works, right? It seems like you took some people who weren't doing well, you gave them a training program, now they're doing well. A lot of people would take that as evidence that the training program works. They might put it up on their website and sell it and try and scale up, right? But let's consider an alternative explanation. Notice that she picked out only those who sucked in game 1 to do her fancy training. However, some of those who sucked in game 1 might not be totally sucky players overall. Maybe they're actually decent or even good players, but they just had a really bad day on that first game. Sort of element of luck or chance in addition to their skill. So that subset of people who sucked in game 1 will likely go back to normal and perform better in future games. That means the average performance of those who get the training program will pretty much automatically go up, even if the training program does nothing at all and doesn't work. So this threat to internal validity is called regression to the mean, literally returning to your average. And it explains things like the alleged, sophomore slump that you might have heard of in college sports, where you got some superstar first-year player who often does worse in year 2. Some players just have a lucky year. Maybe they're skilled, but also have luck that year. But then they go back to the true level later on because maybe their skill is the same, but they don't have quite as much luck that year. So they don't have skill plus luck, they just have skill in the second year. Indeed, this is always going to be an issue when you select those who have extreme results and then do a study or training or further testing on them. The initial extreme results were a mix of the real average, their real skill, combined with randomness and luck at the time of that initial measurement. So the most extreme high scores will include those who got really lucky that day. So their skill plus some luck. And the most extreme low scores will include those who got really unlucky that day. So yeah, maybe they're low skill or lower skill, but then they had bad luck on top of that. So if we test them later, the randomness element is going to be different, and thus their scores will tend, on average, to be more moderate, to be not as extreme. So that makes it seem, that makes it seem like the great scorers got worse, but it's actually just regression to the mean, even if their abilities didn't change at all. So the training might not change a single thing about their abilities, but it looks like the poor scorers are now performing better, right? So it seems like our training program works when we instituted it on just those low scorers, even if the training has no effect at all. That's just regression to the mean. It's just going back toward their true average. So all these problems I've named here, history, maturation, testing effects, instrument change, mortality, and regression to the mean, these provide alternative explanations where the independent variable isn't the real cause of any differences we find in the dependent variable. We need to rule those things out to remove or minimize alternative explanations and then worry less about these threats to internal validity if we want to be confident that the IV is causing changes in the DV. So one improvement we can make, this is a pretty obvious one, is to address some of these threats, we just add a control group. Like, we could write out our study design like this. We measure both groups at the start, then we give one group the treatment, not the other, then we measure both groups at the end, and we see if group 1 changed more than group 2. Now this doesn't fix all threats to internal validity, but it helps a lot because if we do it right, we could at least be confident both groups experience the same basic external events. So that helps with the history threat. We can be sure both groups, mature at the same amount over time. So that helps with the maturation threat. And both groups get tested twice. So that kind of rules out our testing effects if group 1 does better at the end. And if we use the same measurement instruments for both groups and at both times, then we wouldn't really have that to explain group 1 improving more. So we can kind of rule out a lot of these alternative explanations if we add a control group in the proper way. So let's say group 1 improves more than group 2. That would seem to imply the treatment caused an effect, right, above and beyond all these other effects which applied equally to both groups. But the problem is now there's another difference. Group 1 knows they're getting a treatment. Like, if kids get put in a math program or some basketball players get put in a special training program, they know they're getting this amazing targeted training, this patented fancy system of training, and they may have more expectation for improvement, which might affect their motivation or cause some other placebo effect. And as you probably know, the placebo effect is basically when merely expecting or believing that a treatment will work causes some improvement, even if the treatment is fake, it has no active ingredients, it doesn't actually work, that sort of thing. So maybe group 1 just does better because they have increased hope, or they think they're supposed to be improving. So in that case, we can fix things by adding a placebo group as our control group. What we mean by that is to give group 2 a fake treatment, to have them do something similar to the training that isn't the training, but where they have similar expectations and similar beliefs that it'll help them improve. So I don't know, maybe one group of basketball players got the patented fancy training program that involves mental imagery, like picturing themselves in their mind's eye at random times throughout the day making successful free throw shots. Maybe that was the treatment. Meanwhile, if that's the treatment, then group 2 basketball players, maybe they get a fake training program that just involves mental imagery again, doing, picturing things in their mind's eye throughout the day, but this time they're supposed to picture themselves doing exercise or running up and down the basketball court, and they're told that this is known to help with free throws. So they may have similar expectations, right? So now both groups think they're getting a real treatment and both have similar expectation of improvement. And we can even, measure this a bit if we ask them about their belief in the treatment or the fake treatment that they're getting. So now, group 1, if they improve more than group 2, we can at least be a little more confident the treatment actually works, instead of just being a placebo effect. In other words, this design has better internal validity than just a control group where group 2 does nothing at all. We might have to try different placebos in different, future studies to be sure that we're creating similar expectancy effects. But if the treatment keeps working better than all the different placebos and fake treatments that we try, we might become more sure that it's actually the treatment that's genuinely doing things. Now let's talk through one more scenario. Let's say we want to know if a math training program works, and this time we used a control group, sweet. So our treatment group is 50 boys who we measure at the start, then they get the training program, then we measure them at the end. And meanwhile, we've now got a control group. Let's say we found 50 girls who we measure at the start, then they get a placebo treatment, and then, some fake training or whatever, then we measure them at the end. Imagine these results. Perhaps the treatment group shows more improvement than the control group. Would you think that the training that the treatment group got, that works? Pause and think it through for a moment. Well, no, because the treatment group was all boys and the placebo group was all girls. So if group 1 improves more, we don't know if it's due to the treatment or due to gender. When we selected who goes into what group, we did it in a biased way, a way that might skew our results, which is another threat to internal validity called selection. So selection bias means during the selection or the assignment steps of your study, we unintentionally introduced additional differences between the groups, other than the independent variable. So now we're not comparing apples to apples and seeing if the treatment of apples changes more than the control apples. Now we're comparing apples to oranges and giving the apples a treatment and the oranges no treatment, but at the end of the study, we have no idea if the apples are different because of the treatment or because they're apples and would have changed in some way anyway. Likewise, if I pick 2 schools in the same school district and I apply my fancy math training program at one of those schools and let the other school serve as a control group, they don't get the fancy training program, and then I find that the first school improves more in math, that shouldn't convince me that my fancy training program works Because maybe the kids in school 1 were different in some way. Maybe that school that I did the training program in is also in a richer neighborhood, so it's better funded. Or maybe that second school just happened to have more kids of single parents, or just happened to have crappier math teachers that year. The point is, if the groups start out with differences based on how we selected or assigned them, then those differences might explain any later differences in the dependent variable. In other words, those are alternative explanations, things other than the IV that would cause the results. So what this should really sort of reinforce is that we want our groups to start out the same. We want to avoid a lot of this by having our groups start the same. And I'll talk more about this in the next video, but to give a quick version, our best solution here is to use random assignment. This means putting people into groups randomly, so each person has an equal chance of ending up in either group. It makes the group start out roughly equally on everything. That means it controls for known and for unknown differences among all your participants. It makes every extraneous variable start out balanced across the groups. So randomizing, assuming you use enough people, randomizing splits every factor across the groups pretty evenly. So we might write it out like this. The R for randomizing to choose who goes into group 1 or group 2, then do our usual control group, and ideally this will be a placebo control, some sort of control group that's similar to the treatment, and then we measure the outcome of those two groups. But you might notice, based on how I diagrammed it out here, I've reintroduced a little problem here. Even if group 1 ends up better than group 2 at the end, and we can be, confident from the randomization procedure that the groups started out the same, we don't actually have any idea how much they improved with a research design like you see at the top here. We don't know how much group 1 got better, even if they have a higher score at the end than group 2. So don't forget, we want to also measure things before introducing our treatment. This has two benefits. Now we can see how much groups change from the beginning, so we can report the improvement of our treatment group and compare that to the improvement of the placebo group. And any sort of extra improvement above and beyond the placebo improvement, that would be our real treatment effect. But also the second benefit is that we can confirm our randomization worked. This is especially important for smaller sample sizes, but it's helpful regardless. We can confirm that both groups started out the same, just as randomization should do, right? That's the whole point of randomization, is groups starting out the same. This design allows us to double check. Did they start out the same on our dependent variable at the start of the experiment? But we still have a problem. Now we don't know how much improvement comes from the testing effect, right? We talked about that as a threat to internal validity. Remember, where being exposed to the test at the start can affect your later results? We may now be confident that the treatment group improves more, so the testing effect can't explain it all since both groups suffer a testing effect, but it does make it hard to quantify the improvement in our treatment since some of it may come from a testing effect. So ideally, we would set things up to get around that problem too, which requires a little more complicated of a design, but it brings us to this clever solution called the Solomon 4-group design, or just 4-group design to keep it simple. With a setup like this, we've got a really good way to figure out how well a treatment works. We randomize a big sample of people into 4 groups using random assignment. Some of them we give a pre-test and a post-test, so we measure at the start and the end, which means there is a potential testing effect for those people, but it at least lets us quantify the amount of change, which is one goal of our study. But now we can also quantify the testing effect. So if you compare groups 1 and 3, or compare groups 2 and 4, where the only difference is who got the pretest, now you can figure out how much testing effect there is. You can figure out how much of an effect there is just having the pretest versus not, and correct for that. Meanwhile, our main comparison would be, groups 1 and 2 to compare treatment to placebo, and groups 3 and 4 to again make the same comparison. Hopefully find a similar pattern. Otherwise, we've now detected a complex interaction of our treatment with the pretesting. So this design takes a lot more participants to get, 4 groups of big enough size, but it allows us to make much stronger conclusions from our results. Now, granted, most of the time we don't need a full-on Solomon 4-group design. We might already have confirmed in past research that there isn't much testing effect. Or maybe we don't care about the testing effect right now because we don't need to quantify exactly how much change our treatment causes. Maybe we just want to first establish that our treatment does cause more change than a control group or a placebo treatment. And maybe instead of a 4-group design in a single study, we might test all these other comparisons across a series of studies that, looking at all those variables in slightly different ways. Sometimes with a pretest, sometimes without. But you can see how the logic helps us narrow down narrow things down to answer the questions we really care about, and how important it is to consider threats to internal validity when setting up our study if we don't want to be stuck with a bunch of alternative explanations for our results at the end.